Hello and welcome to the first presentation of this new fiscal year. My name is Malou Gabert and I'm a bilingual project assistant at Health Nexus. Today, Nancy Lockwood will be talking about the application process for the FASD Support Group's funding. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the FASD Ontario website. So now I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. So Health Nexus is located on territory that for thousands of years has been the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, Nayonwetsayo, Haudenosaunee, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're proud to take our part in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. Health Nexus team members are grateful for the opportunity to partner with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and to work on this territory. Now, a little bit about Health Nexus. So for more than 30 years, Health Nexus has been working with diverse partners to help create healthy, equitable, and vibrant communities where people of all ages can thrive. In 2018, the Government of Ontario contracted Health Nexus to host multiple initiatives to support people with FASD, their families, and supporters as part of their provincial FASD strategy. And now I'm going to hand it over to Nancy to continue the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Malou. So I also just want to say I'm so excited about this initiative with these groups that have been started the last few years to support people with FASD and their families and their supporters. I've been working and living in the world of FASD for over 25 years, and I think this initiative is one of the most exciting ones to have come along in Ontario in a long time. So here are some highlights of the funding process, the application process, and we're also going to give you some ideas or ideas of things that have happened in the past, ideas you can draw on. So let's start with talking about the purpose of this funding. The Government of Ontario started this initiative as one of their provincial FASD initiatives. And the purpose is to bring together people with FASD and their families and supporters to improve outcomes and build connections. So we know that too many people with FASD are quite isolated. We hear that happens more often as people with FASD get older, not always, but it's something that can happen. So these initiatives can help to bring people with FASD together doing shared fun activities. It's also a way for their family members to connect with other people who are on a similar journey to them. Next slide, please, Malou. So the amounts of the subsidies are up to $4,500 per group. So that is the maximum that a group can receive in one fiscal cycle. And this can be for a renewal of an existing group, or it could be a group that was run last year that you want to add some elements to enhance it. Perhaps you want to take what you did last year and bring it to a larger group, or it's for new groups with new ideas, new initiatives in Ontario. And we want to bring together families and people with FASD, engage them in community activities. And the goals are to support each other. So the groups might be a forum for sharing information about FASD. You may be running a group that's going to build knowledge exchange across the province. So for example, in previous years, some groups have hired series of guest speakers or hosted an FASD conference in their region. Those would be examples of knowledge exchange. It could be learning how to share best practices to support people with FASD between communities. So it could be neighboring communities partnering together to, again, bring in guest speakers or people with lived experience to share their knowledge, and through that we can improve outcomes for people with FASD. Or the groups might be focused on mentorship. So that might be an older person with FASD mentoring a group of younger people. It could be parents and caregivers who are well along their journey raising children and youth with FASD, sharing their knowledge with parents and caregivers who are earlier on their journey. But all of these groups, again, are made with a goal to improve lives of people with FASD. Next slide, please, Malu, and we'll have a chance to ask questions at the end. So who can facilitate these groups? They can be facilitated by service providers or volunteers, or ideally both, because that way you're getting shared perspectives. Also in my work, I've found there are a lot of people working in this field who actually also have lived experience. Sometimes it was having that lived experience first that gave us the impetus to pursue careers in this field and build our own education. And your groups can either be in person or virtual, or again, it could be a combination of both. So for instance, I've seen conferences where they had participants joining both virtually or in person, or sometimes there are regular meetings on a virtual platform, but a couple of times a year, they might gather in person. So we all know that we've become more comfortable with the virtual way to connect, but at the same time, sometimes there's nothing like seeing people in person, giving them a hug and sharing those sorts of stories that are sometimes harder to share in a virtual setting. We know that these groups can just be a gathering spot for people, a place for all of us to connect and share our information, and again, mentor new group members. I'm going to get into that a little bit as we go along. Next slide, please, Malu. So whom can apply? People who do not belong to an organization or an agency can apply. So that could be parents and caregivers, adult siblings, people with FASD. Also, if you work at a charitable or nonprofit organization or volunteer at one, you also can apply. Next slide. Now, who are the target populations for the grants? Well, first of all, children, youth, or adults with FASD, and this could be regional or it could be provincial. Just remember, we want to have as big an impact as possible. That's something we're really looking for this year, is ideas that can have quite a wide-ranging impact. Applications can come from family members of people with FASD, so that might be parents, caregivers, siblings. Please keep in mind when we say families, this could be biological or families formed through adoption, kin, or customary care. I have run groups, for instance, for grandparents of people with FASD, grandparents who are raising their children with FASD. So again, think outside the box, but don't limit yourself to only thinking of families formed through adoption. If you're not familiar with customary care, those are children who are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, who are being raised not by their parents, but through other members of their community. So that's another sort of community application that could be considered. Next slide. We are really looking for applications that support diverse populations, that support equity, diversity, and inclusion. So for instance, for Francophone communities, applications that are focused on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, or other racialized populations, members of the 2S LGBTQIA community, people with visible and invisible disabilities. And as we all know, FASD is 90% of the time an invisible disability. Only about 10% of times do you see physical characteristics, observable physical facial characteristics with FASD. They could be groups focused on newcomers or members of remote and rural communities. And we know that in these more remote communities, it can be even harder to build connections. So having a virtual sort of platform might be just the ticket. Next slide, please. So there have been some really innovative groups in the last couple of years. I find it so exciting to hear about some of these groups. I'm just going to focus on some ideas that we've seen. There have been a few groups that have been focused on cooking. For instance, it might be a group where children are preparing a recipe with a facilitator while the parents meet elsewhere, and then everyone joins together for a family meal. I heard of a group that they use those meal delivery kits and purchased them for adults with FASD, and they made them together as a group. I've heard of ideas for groups like getting a group of people with FASD together to cook in a community kitchen, and think of all the different learning skills that involves. Planning, buying groceries, following a recipe, cooking together with guidance, and then they would bring containers and take home meals that could fill their freezer. So that's one idea. I have seen groups with an Indigenous focus, for instance, groups focused on drumming circles. Last year, there was a group that was focused on Ojibwe spirit horses. Others focus on activities for whole families or to build connections among people with FASD, such as bowling events. We've heard of family nature walks, where all members of the family are joining together to do a really fun activity and meet other families that are on a similar sort of journey. A couple of years ago, before I was working as an FASD consultant for Health Nexus, I applied and received a grant to run a video gaming group for older youth with FASD. So with my funding, I hired a social worker to mentor an adult with FASD to run the group. And they met weekly all through the grant cycle to play games together with facilitation from the social worker, but they were also learning all sorts of social skills at the same time and building connections. And I really want to highlight those connections often continued after the cycle of the grant. So that's something else that we're looking at, is sustainability or connections that can continue even when the grant cycle is over. So get thinking about some ideas. Think, what are common strengths of people with FASD? How can we capitalize on those to bring people together? It may be daunting for youth with FASD to just sit and talk, but if they're doing an activity together, that might be more welcoming. Next slide, please. Something else to think about is you don't always have to invent the wheel. You don't necessarily need to come up with a new idea. Perhaps you heard of a group in another region last year that you want to replicate in your region. So you could think of taking your funding and using a small portion to hire the leader of that group from last year to be a consultant to you, to tell you what they did, how they went about it. They could tell you what some of their successes were and also some challenges, and they could help you brainstorm ways to overcome those challenges. So I chose that little graphic because sometimes we're so busy thinking of new ideas that we don't realize we can use the wheel that somebody else has already created. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for in the applications, and how are successful applications chosen? So first of all, the team that looks at the applications is going to see whether you have really clearly explained what the activities are, what your goals are for the group, and have a really clear budget showing how you're going to be spending the funds. Try to have an activity that has potential to be evaluated. How can we measure whether you were successful, or what are the things you're going to look for to know that your group was successful? You need to be meeting all the eligibility criteria. For instance, you have to be located in Ontario. There are certain things that can't be funded, which we're going to be talking about. We need to see that the activities have a clear purpose. We need to see how that's going to improve outcomes for people with FASD and their families. Is it aligned with the intent of this funding? Does the application support one or more of those identified target audiences that we were just talking about? And are the funds going to be used for things that are eligible? Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Next slide. So these are some of the activities that could be funded. So it could be developing new materials that are going to help people with FASD and or their family members, or it may be taking an existing material and adjusting it to make it culturally relevant. Perhaps it's something that was only created in English and you want to make it accessible and culturally relevant for a Francophone population. Or it might be something created in English and you want to make a similar version for a First Nations community and make sure that it's culturally relevant. You can use it for promotion of your activities or group or events. You can use it for planning or operational support for your group. So for instance, if you're running a group for adults, you could use it to pay someone to offer childcare or respite for their children so they can attend the group. You might plan one of your meetings in person and want to share a meal together. So you could use it to order Uber Eats for your group members. It can be used for printing or photocopying of materials, or equipment to support virtual gatherings, for instance, a Zoom license. If you really want to maximize your money, you might even want to partner with another group and share a Zoom license so that you're both kicking in 50% of the amount. So again, brainstorm, think outside the box for ways you can maximize that amount of funding. Next slide, please. You can use the funding to hire consultants or to offer honoraria to guest speakers. Guest speakers can get booked early, so that's a suggestion to try to book your guest speakers well in advance. You can hire people with lived experience to talk about their journey. You can give them an honoraria for this. Make sure if they are on ODSP, the Ontario Disability Supports Program, that you are offering an honoraria that is not an honorarium, that is not going to jeopardize their ODSP. Otherwise, if it's a negotiated amount or salary, they're going to need to declare it as income, and that has potential, if they do that for a number of groups, to affect their ODSP. You can reach out to the Health Nexus team if you have questions about any of these points. You can use funds to pay for members of your group to attend an event. So for example, years ago, I was working at Able To, and we had an annual symposium. And we know some groups in Ontario used part of their funding to fund bursaries for group members to attend our virtual symposium. So that would be an example. Keep in mind that only up to 25% of your funding can be used to provide an honorarium for group facilitation. So for example, if you're going to be the facilitator for your group, you can only use 25% maximum of those funds to pay yourself for your facilitation of the group. Next slide, please. Also, if you're thinking of questions as we go along, feel free to write them in the chat and we can address them at the end. These are things that cannot be funded. So this one's pretty obvious: costs that are not related to an activity outlined in the application form. So if you've clearly said what you're going to do, you've got a clear budget, and then you decide you want to fund something else, you would need to submit a budget amendment form request to make this change, and that would be reviewed by this same team that reviews the applications. You can't ask for funding for something that will be covered through another source of funding. So if you're working for a nonprofit and you have your own Zoom license, you can't then ask Health Nexus to fund your Zoom license. That's an example. It cannot be used to fund FASD public awareness campaigns. That has been something that was decided by the ministry. So say, for instance, you wanted to run an awareness event for FASD Awareness Day on September 9th. That could not be a funded activity. And Malou, please jump in if I ever say something that isn't. I know you know all of these nuances really well, so feel free to jump in if something isn't exactly correct. You can't use it for donations or to give money to any kind of fundraising campaign or event. You can't use it to repay any existing debts. It can't fund political or religious activities. So for instance, if you're having monthly group meetings, it could not have a religious focus. That's not to say we aren't supportive of and inclusive of religious activities, but that's not what this funding is for. It can't be funding for activities outside Ontario. And it can't be used to fund a group leader's own products. So say, for instance, you have written a book about FASD, you could not use the funds to buy copies of that book to give to everybody in the group and you make the profit. So you can't make a profit from your activities. Next slide, please. At the end of last funding cycle, a survey was sent out to all the group leaders to share things that they found successful, things that worked really well, and to identify some challenges. These are 5 of the things that came up more than once as areas of challenge. So those who were running groups in remote areas, some had difficulty getting delivery of supplies for their activities in a timely manner. So you need to have completed all your activities. You'll see in the timeline by mid-March. So you need to make sure you've ordered things early, had delivery, so you are ready to launch your activities in a timely manner. For those group leaders who have asked for amendments to their budget, we got a response that some found the process to get a response was too slow. So the Health Nexus team working on this FASD initiative have a goal to make that more timely this year. Some expressed challenges finding speakers and venues. The Health Nexus team can help you with finding speakers, but again, try to book early because the best speakers are the ones that have really full schedules. Some had challenges figuring out how to record a training event and allowing time for question and answer while maintaining confidentiality. So we know a lot of people with FASD and their families want their information to be confidential, but may very well have questions. So there are a lot of strategies to support that. For instance, you could use the webinar function for the guest speaker, and you could ask people to ask their questions in the Q&A function as opposed to the chat function. In the Q&A function, you can be anonymous. So those are the sorts of tips that we can help with. And some have actually had trouble spending their full budget. If the full budget isn't spent by the end of the year, the money is going to have to go back to the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. If a group is having trouble spending their budget, we want to know about that early, and then we can offer advice on how to spend the budget, or perhaps take some of that budget and offer it to another group, or fund one other small initiative. So we're really maximizing the impact of this funding. Next slide, please. These are some suggestions that the group leaders in the last funding cycle shared. So many said, connect with other group leaders, pool your ideas, perhaps partner this year on groups, or just brainstorm together. Sometimes they might have ideas of good guest speakers, people with lived experience who might want to share their story. Some said to avoid in-person events in the winter months in areas that have harsh weather. Understandable. Many said they really enjoyed events that involved the whole family, where families can do fun activities together. And I think too often events are focused on challenges, rightly so. We all want to learn strategies for challenges, but at the same time, families just want time to enjoy each other's company. Virtual options for rural families. A few said, keep it simple and be flexible. So even though we're challenging you to be innovative, that doesn't mean it has to be complicated. So think of simple ideas that are going to be simple to complete within the funding cycle, but also be flexible, because we can't anticipate all the challenges. An example would be COVID, you know, having options for virtual attendance. Let's hope it doesn't happen again in this funding cycle, knock wood, but we need to be flexible. Involve community organizations to help deliver groups. So you might find a community organization could donate space for you to hold an in-person group meeting. If you were hosting a mini conference, perhaps they would donate swag. Those are just some examples. And once again, book your guest speakers well in advance. Next slide, please. Health Nexus can offer you support during this application process. This is being recorded. You can watch it again, or you can share it with people in your network. If you want advice, we'll be sharing an email at the end. You can write for advice. If you're not sure if your idea fits within the guidelines, please reach out and we can brainstorm with you. If you aren't sure about the budget piece or whether one of the activities would fit, reach out. We can also advise on the strengths of your application. If you wanted to partner with another group or another region, we might be able to connect you. Or if you heard of a group last year and want to connect with that group leader, but you don't know how, we can arrange that for you as well. And keep in mind that we want to see applications that are sustainable. So you may or may not be able to apply again next year, or you could apply again, but you might not get the same amount 2 years in a row. So think as well, when you're making an application in the future, are there other ways that I might be able to sustain this? It might be something that you just need funding the first year, and after that you can run it on your own. So think of that when you're writing your application. Next slide, please. And then if you're a successful applicant, hopefully you are, Health Nexus will be able to offer you ongoing support over the coming year. By year, I mean up until the end of March when the funding cycle ends. So you can receive telephone and email support from Malu, the project coordinator. There will be webinars and teleconferences to share information on the groups, helpful advice, things we've learned. You will get a list of the other FASD support groups and how to contact the facilitators so that you can make connections. There will be regular meetings for all the group leaders over the course of the year, which will provide opportunity to meet each other, make connections, but also to ask questions of the other group members. Often the people that have the best ideas or the answers to the tough questions are the families with children, youth, and adults with FASD. Health Nexus has a wonderful listserv. They send out emails with all sorts of helpful information. So if you are planning an event or a group or a conference, a speaker series, you can send that to Malu, and she will be able to distribute that on the listserv. And also there are all sorts of documents and tools that will be able to help you in the process. Next slide, please. So this is the schedule for the coming year. The deadline for your application is June 12th. If you apply, you will be notified of whether you have been chosen for one of the funding grants by June 26th. You will then receive a legal agreement that you will need to sign and return by July 10th. You'll be asked to submit a midterm report. It is very user-friendly and simple. Don't let that scare you off. That whole process has been really streamlined. That will be due November 15th. And again, the Health Nexus team is here to support you with that if you have questions. Your activities must be completed by March 15th of 2024. You need to have spent your funds, completed your bookkeeping by the end of March, and your final report, again, very user-friendly and streamlined, will be due on April 8th of 2024. Next slide, please. Oh, we're at the question. So this is the contact. If you have questions during the application process, please reach out to FASD Support no S on the end, at healthnexus.ca. And at this point, Malou, are there any questions in the chat at this point?
Not so far, no, but if anyone has any question and wants to either write them down in the chat or unmute themselves and ask live, we'd be happy to answer them. Ruth Ann, I see you have your hand up. No longer.
Sorry about that.
Oh.
Sorry, Malou. Thank you, Nancy, for that presentation, and thank you, Malou, as well. I have two questions, if that's okay. So our group has grown a lot. We have not opened up really, like it's more word of mouth right now, but we already have almost 30 families and supporting about 47 youth and children.
Wonderful.
Thank you. One of the questions that we have is, so last year was the first time we asked the city of Mississauga to light up the clock tower in support of FASD Day, and they did. This year we put in a request for Brampton and Mississauga, and we got those both approved. Now, my question is, we would like to continue, like we've been doing red rock painting. We bought food with the Health Nexus funding and our rocks and our paints and all that kind of stuff. And we do that at Celebration Square. This year, we were wondering if we could use that funding to do more crafts and get more food to accommodate both Brampton location and Mississauga, because we're going to split our group. Because our group is just too big. And last year we had over 200 people at the Celebration Square. So I didn't know if using the funding could be just for that specific event to support our families.
My honest answer is that's a little bit tricky. Malou, do you have feedback on that one? I could argue that one either way.
Well, so Ruth Ann, you want to use the funding, like one of the funding specifically for the event organization and have apply for another funding for other group activities. Is that correct?
Yes, as part of our group activities. So just to buy like our food for our families, the supplies that we would need for our red rock painting, like any activities that we would be doing on that day. Is basically what we're asking for. That's question number one.
Actually, well, before you go on, Ruth, I do think you need to, in your application, it would need to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Malou, it would need to be really clear that that's not, your goal is not FASD advocacy. Like I can see how what you're saying is a celebration and a gathering and an activity and a meal and those sorts of things. That's why I'm saying I'm not exactly sure, but you're hosting it on FASD Awareness Day as part of an FASD awareness event.
I guess it would fall kind of under that, because so last year what we did was we all met, we ordered Subway, we did our activities and stuff like that, and we all stood and kind of took pictures. It was our first time in Peel that we were recognized, and we kind of stood and we watched the clock tower turn red. And we as families, like I had families from Brampton and Caledon come down to Celebration Square, and we just stood and watched that tower go up, and a few of us cried and the kids ran around, and it was just amazing because, I mean, Peel is pretty large. And again, I mean, I have never seen anything like that to support my family. So to offer that for all of our families that were there was amazing. It was literally amazing. And I can't lie and say that people didn't come up to us and ask questions like, what are you guys doing? You know, and we did answer questions, but it gave opportunity for not only myself, but for other families to talk about and explain. Like we got to use all of the tools that we learned from, I've been to the Able To conference. I've seen work that you've done before in the past, Malou, your presentation, stuff like that. It gives us the opportunity to actually put those into practice and to talk to other people, right? Because we talk about being shut in, and that's 100%, very factual. but it's empowering to be able to kind of share what we're going through with the community. So it's not really to advertise and say FASD is the day kind of thing, but we as a community, we as a group, we want to honor and celebrate that day. And I just didn't know, like you guys were saying, like it just falls between advocacy but really it's a celebration. It's just out in the public.
I think it kind of falls, as you said, in between, because I could see how you're organizing activities that fall during FASD Awareness Month and, you know, are part of a celebration, but the purpose of the activity is not to just raise awareness. It's just an activity that could take place really at any time of the year. You just chose to make it take place during FASD Awareness Month because it's, you know, it's the month where, I mean, lots of activities take place during that month, right? It's a celebration. So I think it falls, as you said, a little bit in between. I think if you word it correctly, and if the sole purpose is not just to create awareness, it can definitely be considered. But it has to be clear. You know, the intentions have to be clear, because as we said, we've been asked by the ministry to not fund activities whose main purpose is to raise awareness for FASD.
Okay.
And what if you did it? Sorry, Ruth, why don't you do a draft, you know, well in advance of the June 12th date, which I know isn't that far away, and send it to FASD support, and we could even brainstorm with you, because it sounds like a wonderful initiative, but we want to make sure that it falls within the purview of the funding.
Okay, sounds good.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then my second question is, because our group is quite large, we were considering creating a peer leadership training so that so we could break the group up, right? Not necessarily break us up, but we have like a couple other group leaders that would kind of step into the role, because I'm one person and it's hard and it's stressful, and I too live this journey too. And I think our group, like we've been together for 4 years now, and I have 2 families that are willing to step up, but they feel like they want some training. So we kind of decided, well, what if we put together a peer leadership training model and then offer that to the people in our group who are willing to start having smaller groups from the Peel region. So is that something that we could look into using the funding for?
I think it sounds really interesting. Yeah.
I think it's an
sounds intriguing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see a question from Kathy. The first part is Blue Jeans. Last year, part of the Blue Jeans app was sponsored via Nexus. I don't know about that. Do you, Malu?
I don't recall, if I'm honest. I don't recall what the Blue Jeans app is about. I don't know if Kathy wants to unmute, or if you want to write in the chat.
Yeah, Kathy, if you could elaborate on that, or if you wanted to unmute, but I'm going to go on to your next question. Presenters can be outside of Ontario still. I believe that's fine, correct, Malu? The presenter can be from outside of Ontario, but the group leader and members need to be in Ontario. And then question 3, this past year I requested an extension so that one March break activity could occur on the 16th or 17th. So that's more of a case by case. That please do your best to complete by the 15th. And usually the March break starts early enough that you could. So that would be an exception. Would you not say, Malu?
Yes, I'm going to join you on that. It's really a case-by-case basis. We really ask that you do everything you can to have your activities take place before March 15th. On a case-by-case basis, if you know you had an activity planned before something happened, you have to have it happen on the second half of March. It can be authorized, but it's really case-by-case. And so if you can plan, like if you're planning now already for activities to potentially happen after that, we would ask that you try to make them happen at another time of the year so that it doesn't go beyond the deadline. But once again, it's happened before that we provided extensions for a few days later in the month of March, a few days after the deadline, but case by case.
I am muted. It's Kathy.
Hi,
Hi,
Kathy.
Kathy.
You can hear me? Okay, thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with the March activity, it was that it did need to get moved. However, as it turned out, because I had 2 activities during March break, it was great. I had one on the Monday and then one on the Thursday. It was the day after the deadline or whatever. And I thought, oh, that was nice because it spread it out a little bit. And a lot of the kids then participated in both. So, but that's helpful. The Blue Jeans app and honestly, I never thought of it, Nancy, until you mentioned the Zoom would not be something that you could sponsor. So at my agency, we have Blue Jeans, but because it's not always available. So that's why part of the cost of it was covered by Nexus so that I could have it for speakers and you know, groups and all that kind of thing.
Is it a streaming platform or is it like Zoom?
It's like Zoom. It's just considered by some agencies to be more secure.
Oh,
I actually prefer Zoom, but that's the Blue Jeans one. Is, yeah. So probably I shouldn't.
Sorry, go ahead.
I probably shouldn't put in for that again.
So we can fund a platform like Zoom or, you know, an equivalent, but it needs to not already be funded by your organization. For example, at Health Nexus, we have a Zoom license paid for by Health Nexus. If we receive some funding from another agencies for part of our projects, we couldn't pay again for that, ask for money, use the money to pay for the Zoom license, considering that it's already paid for by the funds given to us by, you know, the ministry or other funders. So we just need to make sure that it's not an expense that's already funded by your organization, and then that you're using our funds to go towards that where you already had that license. But if it's an additional Zoom license specifically for the support group, for example, then that would be perfectly fine that we pay for it, because it would be, you know, purchased specifically for the usage of your group. Or if you just didn't have a Zoom license, if it's a group run by volunteers, for example, we're happy to consider the payment of the Zoom license, of course.
Okay, so it sounds like this is okay then, because yes, it's so that it's available for whenever I have an activity related to FASD. Okay, thank you both very much.
Of course.
No problem.
Sarah, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you so much for the information here. I just have a few questions. So this year, our support group, we're turning from a virtual to an in-person support group. And I was talking to one of our caregiver facilitators, and they were asking if we could use some of the funding to just purchase an honorarium for, and particularly a mental health and sexuality guest speaker from out of our area. I'm in the process of getting quotes right now, but I don't know if I'll get the quote in time for the application. It takes them a while to get back to me. So wondering if I could just put it estimated and do like an amendment after. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. If you know, when you draft your budget and your plans for the year, obviously it's nice to ask for the quotes to have a better idea. But if you don't have answers yet, you can do an estimate of what you think, what amount of your budget is going to go towards presenters, if you only have one or if you have several, to say, you know, for example, I want to spend $800 this year on the presenters. And then if it turns out that's a little less, a little more, you can always reach out. We can provide you with a budget amendment form, and then you can, you know, make the amendments where needed. So that's not a problem at all.
All right, thank you so much, Malu. And I guess this is a question for every facilitator here on the call. So we do have, like, just with the virtual group, we did have a consistent 6 plus the 2 facilitators, so 6 to 8 people regularly. And we would like to continue to increase that. And we've been having some challenges just increasing the numbers of participation. So like, it's so amazing. I think it was Ruth Ann that said you have 40 47 people attending regular. That's just amazing to me. So wondering if anybody has any feedback about increasing the participation. Is there any advertisement that that we need to be doing more regularly? Like, any suggestions? I'm open to hearing them.
I'm wondering, Sarah, whether you could send out some kind of survey to people that you think might be interested in your community, or send to some agencies and ask them just to ask questions like, would you prefer in person or virtual or a combination of both? See if it's the time of day, you know, so for varying reasons, different times of day can be a challenge. You might want to start there. I remember that with a group that was kind of had dwindling attendance, that then we found it was things like it might be to do with child care. It might be being exhausted or having to help with homework at the end of the day. So that's one suggestion, but does anyone else have one?
One of the quick thing I want to mention for groups, when you launch your group, we're happy to share it on the FASD Ontario website and on the FASD listserv, and even to the we have a distribution list for all the group funded each year. So even just sharing with the other groups to say, hey, if you know anyone in that region, if you want to spread the word, so that we can make sure that everyone is aware that there's this group happening in your area, in your region. And with us spreading the word, it can help a little bit increase the numbers, hopefully.
Yeah, I do notice the listserv, like the advertisements for that. So do I contact you for that, Malu, to send it out? Okay, so that's all right. That's good to know. Thanks, Malu.
Of course.
Something else, Sarah, you might want to think about is, and you maybe already saw it, I think it was last week, Malu sent out an email on the listserv about an event being hosted by Sally Seabrook on FASD and sexuality. And I was just reading the bios of the speakers, and they were so impressive. I just wondered if you might even want to look at the speakers, and if you have any challenges with some of the ones that you've reached out to, you might want to look at that as well.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Nancy.
My pleasure. Does anybody else have any questions, either in the Q&A or feel free to just unmute yourself?
I don't see anything in the Q&A, but I see Ruth has her hand up.
Hi, so I just wanted to say to Sarah that for our group, it was really hard in the beginning to have the attendance. And then I think what we found out over the years was it was really helpful. Families started to say it was really helpful when we sent out like the night before reminders of the group. And also it was helpful to build our group up, we shared a lot. So we did through Health Nexus funding, we were able to do a bunch of a speaker series. So we had a bunch of speakers and we invited other groups to come to that. And then that kind of got the word of mouth out, because we haven't yet opened up, because I can't take on the flood that's going to come in if we reach out to like our CAS and our other areas. So we're not prepared for that as yet, but through other families, it was, and again, it's FAS or suspected FAS that kind of grew our numbers, because not everybody in our group has a formal diagnosis, but we still support that way as well. So letting people know that even if it's a suspected case, you are open to, I don't know if your agency is open to that, but we are open to that.
No, we are.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. Yeah, most of our families, I think the children are possible FASD right now. Yeah.
Yes, and then also giving the parents, like we in our group, we talk about share with your school, right? Because principals tend to know other families, and then if you have a link through there, you're accessible through that. So schools are a huge resource for sharing with other families.
Okay, that's a good point, because I am on the Special Education Advisory Committee in one of our school boards. So I try to share as much as I can at that level. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you, Ruth.
There's something else that might be helpful, Sarah, too, is even choosing topics to focus on at each meeting. But again, surveying at the very start and say, what are the topics that you're most interested in? And that way, you know, you're responding to the needs of the community, like education or justice or mental health, things like that. And you probably have already been doing that.
Yeah, but we've been doing it, and there's been so many topics that our caregivers suggest. And we also, in our facilitators group, we do have caregiver representatives as well. So that's why the mental health and sexuality topic came up, and they're like, oh, we really want a guest speaker from out of the region. So that was a really great idea from their part. So it's not all credit to me. I just ask the questions and do the advertisements, but our caregivers do most of the engagement work and ideas.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you all. This has been really helpful session.
You're very welcome.
So shall we wrap up, Malu?
Yeah, I don't see any other question. There's just one question that I answered. I wrote down the answer. Joanne was asking when the presentation will be available. So I'll just tell all of you. I'll send the recording later this afternoon. I'm just going to cut off the beginning and try to cut off my little hiccup there at the beginning as well, if I can. If not, it's fine. And I'll send it via email to the registrants and the usual distribution list, and then I'll post it later this week on the website. But I want to make sure to send it as early as possible, so the website will wait a little. But I'll try to send the recording this afternoon along with the presentation itself, the slides, just so that we can try to support as much as we can.